What is up, everybody? We are live here on the Fantrax X and YouTube channels. This will be on the P2W Fantasy Podcast as well. We are talking Week 3 matchup winners. So each week, I dig through all of the matchups, look at who allows what in terms of yardage, fantasy points per game, look at the season as a whole, look at who is doing what in terms of usage and touches and production. And then I come out with the players that I think will take off this week for fantasy football, for DFS purposes as well. I think through 2 weeks, I'm pretty hot right now. Obviously, you're going to miss every week, but I feel pretty good about the hits that I've had the first 2 weeks. And it all comes from this matchups article that comes in a video form as well. So we're going to talk about each game, who I highlight from those games to take off for your fantasy football lineups and DFS plays. It's going to be a good show. Let's get it. Tell your friends we're rolling here.
I play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, oh, play to win. I play to win, yeah, play to win. I play to win.
All right. Let's get into each matchup. Last week had a lot of hits. Bowers, Derrick Henry, J.K. Dobbins, Chris Godwin, David Montgomery, Jonathan Taylor, Jordan Mason, Zach Charbonnet, Tony Pollard, Malik Nabers, Trey McBride, Isaiah Pacheco. Obviously some misses. Aaron Jones, Lazard, Daniels, Harris, threw in Thielen. So always going to have some hits and misses, but there's always going to be a good justification for why I'm talking about certain guys. So start things off with the Giants versus the Browns. D'Onta Foreman did outtouch Jerome Ford 15-8 last week, which draws some concerns on Ford's guaranteed volume. Ford was extremely efficient on the ground, though, in week 2, averaging 9.14 yards per rushing attempt for his 64. Foreman's 42 yards on 14 attempts meant a much less efficient 3 yards per carry. In week 1, Ford did score a rushing touchdown. He caught 6 balls. That was 18.9 fantasy points. I do believe the Browns will establish the run plenty on the Giants in week 3, especially seeing that the Giants allowed the 5th most rushing yards this season. The Giants have also allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to running backs. So it's a plus matchup for Ford. Even if 2 guys are going to touch the ball, I'm going to bank on the guy that is a more efficient runner with pass catching upside in Jerome Ford. All right, let's get to the next matchup. The Bears versus the Colts. So the Colts have allowed the 12th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, but more importantly, the most total rushing yards this year. So again, let me backtrack there. The Colts have allowed the 12th most fantasy points per game to running backs, but the most total rushing yards. So it's a plus matchup on the ground. DeAndre Swift has totaled just 48 rushing yards on 24 attempts this season, which, if I math that one up, is not good, right? It's bad. Some positive notes, though, beyond the bad, is that Swift has played 70% and 66% of the snaps in the Bears' first 2 games, which dismisses this committee approach that a lot of people projected for the Bears' backfield. Another is the 4 receptions on 5 targets Swift had just last week's, which shows the potential for the Bears to utilize Swift in that aspect of the game more often as a guy who, once caught 62 balls back in 2021. Swift rushed for over 1,000 yards last season. He's averaged 5.47 yards per carry back in 2022. So I fail to think he's not a capable runner of the football. I will acknowledge the offensive line is rough for Chicago, but this Colts team can be run all over. We just saw it last week against Green Bay. The Colts also just lost DeForest Buckner, who has been placed on the IR, and he's a force as a defensive lineman. So look for Swift to have a bounce-back game on the ground. Texans versus Vikings. The Vikings have allowed the 8th most passing yards per game this season so far. Nico Collins has been on a monster tear. Stephon Diggs established his presence in week 1 with the 2 touchdowns. But I have a gut feeling here that C.J. Stroud is going to want to get Tank Dell going in this game. Dell was targeted 7 times in week 1, and he caught 3 of those for 40 yards. In week 2, Dell's usage went down, with him catching just 1 of his 4 targets for negative yardage. Really bad game. One positive note, though, is that Houston has been creative with Dell by having him run the ball, which he did twice for 19 yards in week 1 and then 3 times for 16 yards in week 2. Joe Mixon's not going to be playing, so you're going to have Cam Akers. That could impact how they operate in this offense. And I also think it could be more of Tank Dell running the ball. We joke around about, the next Debo, and you got guys who are not built like him, but like guys like Tank Dell and Jaden Reed who do have that in the bag. And I think that could be more utilized in week 3. And let's not forget about the rookie season between CJ Stroud and Tank Dell. Dell finished weeks with 145, 114, and 149 receiving yards. I mean, he's had that sort of upside as a rookie just last season. So I'm still comfortable flexing Dell this week. And I know there's going to be a point where Stroud's going to want to get his sophomore going there. Same game, Sam Darnold has thrown a pair of touchdowns in each of his first 2 games, paired with an interception for 208 and 268 yards. Darnold finished with 15.62 fantasy points in week 1 as the quarterback 14, and then 20.92 fantasy points in week 2 as the quarterback 4. Last week's big performance came against the 49ers defense. So with these people saying, hey, look at the Texans, they ate up Caleb Williams, they're going to get to Sam Darnold, they're going to make him see ghosts. I don't know, man, because the 49ers in my book should be a fairly decent defense, and Sam Darnold went out there and balled. So the Texans also have allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. I think he's a streamer. I think, Sam Darnold, if you're looking for a quarterback this week, I think he's a decent option, actually. Eagles versus the Saints. With A.J. Brown set to miss a couple of weeks, it is vital to have Devonta Smith in your lineups right now. There is an argument that Devonta should always be a starter in your weekly lineups, but even more important is that, he's extremely important to Jalen Hurts, right? He's obviously a riser without A.J. Brown there. This was evident in week 2 with Devonta Smith earning 10 targets. He caught 7 for 76 yards and a touchdown. That was a good day. He's been targeted 18 times through 2 weeks, and he scored 15.4 and then 20.6 fantasy points. CeeDee Lamb finished with 90 receiving yards and a touchdown, and Jalen Tolbert caught 6 passes for 82 yards last week against the Cowboys. Last week in the Cowboys' big blowout loss against the Saints. So we saw 2 guys have decent yardage in that game, even though, obviously they got blown out by the Saints. And I think that Devonta Smith can have another good one in this matchup this week. The Eagles allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 5th most passing yards so far this season. I think this is a great week for Chris Olave to have his first big day. Derek Carr is off to a great start this year with 443 yards, 5 passing touchdowns, a rushing touchdown, and 1 interception thrown. 47-10 and 44-19 wins for the Saints have created poor game scripts for Chris Olave so far, with just 8 total targets in 2 games. Olave did finish with an encouraging 81 yards on 4 catches, so that's 20.25 yards per catch in week 2. And I think we can see the same in week 3, but with more volume. Olave was targeted 138 times last season, and in tougher matchups, I would bet that he's going to see double-digit targets. And I think this could be the first time that he does this season against a good Eagles offense. So the Eagles offense will push Carr to keep up with them, and their defense will also allow Olave to have his first big game. So let's talk about the Chargers and the Steelers really quick. The Chargers defeated the Raiders 22-10 in week 1. Then the Panthers 26-3 in week 2. The Steelers defeated the Falcons 18-10 in week 1, and then the Broncos 13-6 in week 2. All I am taking away from these 2 teams is that neither one has truly been tested, right? Their opponents were weak opponents. So let's highlight 2 guys that I think will be utilized more, because one thing I will say about both of these offenses is they haven't had to throw the ball a lot. But I think in week 3, they are going to have to. So the first guy, I know Quentin Johnston just had his 2 touchdown game, but let's talk about the rookie Ladd McConkey. He opened up week 1 with 2 good flashes. Number 1, 7 targets. And number 2, a receiving touchdown. McConkey played a healthy 67% of the snaps in that game. In week 2, second-round rookie disappeared, playing 49% of the snaps and catching just 2 of his 4 targets for 26 yards. But what didn't help, obviously, is that passing volume. Herbert only attempted 26 and 20 passes due to them not really having to throw much. I do think that the Steelers matchup will be the first time that, the Chargers will be tested in some sort of capacity, which could mean more volume from Justin Herbert, who I believe is set to play in this game. McConkey's upside in the receiving yard department is probably questionable, but I do think he could be a reliable target if there is more passing volume, and I think that can translate into flex-worthy play. George Pickens opened up the season by catching 6 of 7 targets for 85 yards, and he scored 13.5 fantasy points. Last week, he caught just 2 passes for 29 yards, but he had 2 really big plays from Justin Fields that were taken back by penalties. And Justin Fields only completed 13 passes in that game. So it's another case of they've been winning games without having to throw the ball. It's very evident that Pickens is the most dangerous piece in the Steelers offense through the air as, a guy that's coming off of a 1,140-yard season. And I think more teams, contesting the Steelers is going to mean more volume and more big plays out of George Pickens. So I think week 3 presents the first opportunity this season that we're going to see more passing volume because of 2 teams that probably are going to go back and forth a bit here. And I think the Chargers, if you look at them last year, because, again, they haven't really been contested. Last year, they were very, very friendly to wide receivers for fantasy football. Broncos versus the Buccaneers. After losing plenty of work to Jaleel McLaughlin in week 1, Javonte Williams saw an increase in his snap percentage and usage in week 2. Williams rushed for an extremely inefficient 17 yards on 11 rushes, but he did catch all 5 targets for 48 yards. So rushing inefficiency, obviously that's a red flag, but 16 touches and double-digit fantasy points, that's positive flags. The Buccaneers allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, so if Williams can maintain his lead back role with that involvement in the passing game, I think he could score, again, double-digit fantasy points in week 3. Deep sleeper, Rachaad White's been banged up. We got to, I haven't checked on that this morning at all. And I guess you have to monitor that status with the groin. But Bucky Irving, if this is a game the Buccaneers can take control of, deep leagues, maybe Bucky gets more of a run because of 2 things, right? One, Rachaad White dealing with that groin injury, and if they don't have to push him to rush the ball as much as, maybe they want to rush the ball in general in the game, then maybe they get, some work to Bucky Irving. Also, the Buccaneers have been good, right? I mean, they've done well in the air. If they can handle the Broncos handedly, could be some garbage time for Bucky Irving. So deeper leagues, take a look at Bucky Irving. Let's talk about the Packers versus the Titans. There's been question marks this week. Is it going to be Jordan Love? Is he going to be back? If not, is it going to be Malik Willis, the revenge tour against the Titans? What I'm confident in saying is that Josh Jacobs, good play, right? Jacobs has been limited this week early on because of a back issue, which makes sense because he carried the ball 32 times in week 2. So he was like putting the team on his back in that game at times. But Jacobs finished with 151 rushing yards on the ground last week, which gives us a flashback to 2022 because back in 2022, he led the NFL in rushing, right? Jacobs started the season with 84 rushing yards before his big rushing day last week. So he's thriving in his new home. 5.25 and 4.72 yards per carry through 2 weeks shows solid efficiency. The Titans have allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. So I think a healthy Josh Jacobs should see 18 plus touches and be a good piece in your lineups. Other side of the ball, Tony Pollard has had a solid start to the season himself in his new Tennessee Titans uniform as the clear running back 1 for the Titans. Pollard finished week 1 with 19 touches, and then week 2 with 22 touches, resulting in 18.4 and 15.2 fantasy point weeks. 82 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown in week 1, and 5 receptions for 40 yards in week 2 highlights some upside both on the ground and in the air. So he's going to now face the Green Bay Packers, who allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 11th most rushing yards so far this season. I think he continues to be a good running back to play. The Panthers versus the Raiders. So the Panthers shocked many by announcing this week the pivot from the number 1 pick in 2023, Bryce Young, to veteran Andy Dalton. We can talk all day about opinions on that. Was it the right move, the wrong move? Doesn't matter. Let's look at the matchup. The Raiders allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 4th most rushing yards this season. The Panthers are desperate for a win, so establishing the run and managing the game on the ground against the Raiders makes sense. Chuba Hubbard is coming off of a week where he rushed for a very efficient 6.4 yards per carry, 10 rushes for 64 yards. He also caught 4 of his 5 targets for minimal yards, but the PPR upside is obviously there when you're catching passes as a running back. So I don't think he necessarily wins you your week, but I do think he's a good play because of the matchup, because of the intention to just grind out a win. And, coming off of, an efficient week 2, I like Hubbard in your lineups for week 3. First-round rookie Brock Bowers looks like the best tight end for fantasy football this year. Bowers is truly, quote-unquote, this year's Sam Laporta. I mean, the guy caught 6 of his 8 targets in week 1 for 58 yards, and then he went on to catch all nine targets for a solid 98 yards in week 2. 11.8 and then 18.8 fantasy points scored is a great start for Brock Bowers' very long impact on fantasy football. 17 targets through 2 weeks speaks numbers to his role to the Raiders offense, especially seeing that he is only 1 target shy right now. It's early, but he's only 1 target shy of Davante Adams. Like, that says a lot, man, right? The Panthers allow the second most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season, setting up Bowers to stay hot for fantasy football. The Dolphins versus the Seahawks. So Skylar Thompson will start for the Dolphins in place of Tua with that recent concussion. Obviously, scary stuff there. The Seahawks allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season, which could mean streaming Jonnu Smith. Smith has split snaps with Julian Hill and Durham Smythe for the tight end position, but he's coming off of a very productive week. 6 catches on 7 targets for 53 yards. So if the Seahawks take the lead in this game, or at least make it a close one, there's a chance that Smith, through volume, can build off of that week 2 performance. In week 2, it was the Jackson Smith and Jigba breakout game. And although DK Metcalf had the bigger fantasy score, it was clear that JSN was the go-to target for Geno Smith. JSN caught 12 of his 16 targets for 117 yards and scored 23.7 fantasy points. The combination of JSN not reaching more than 63 yards last season, but hitting 117 yards in his sophomore year, along with the fact that he earned a massive 16 targets, I think speaks worlds to me. I've always been a firm believer in his talent, and with the possibility he turns into Geno's most targeted player this season, I think it could be a breakout fantasy year for Jackson Smith and Jigba. Even with Skylar Thompson, I believe Geno is going to have to push the ball through the air plenty in week 3 against this Dolphins offense. So, Smith threw 44 times last week and completed 33 of them for 327 yards. So the volume could lead to another big Jackson Smith and Jigba game. The Lions versus the Cardinals, probably going to be a fun one. Jameson Williams has transitioned quickly from a fantasy football sleeper to an upside flex option to a weekly wide receiver starter in your fantasy lineups. The former first-round talent has had a series of injuries and off-field matters that have impacted his career so far, but we're starting to see the explosive talent that we projected him to be. Jamo was targeted 9 times and caught 5 of them for a massive 121 receiving yards and a touchdown in week 1 for 24.4 fantasy points. Williams then caught 5 of his 11 targets last game for 79 yards and scored 16.4 fantasy points. 20 targets through 2 weeks with plenty of yardage to go along with it says a lot about Jamo's role in the Detroit offense and the upside he brings. The Cardinals have allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. And if the game turns into an offensive boxing match, I think it could be another huge week for Williams. Jared Goff is coming off of a week where he threw the ball 55 times and finished with 307 passing yards. So obviously there's volume to be had here. First-round talent Marvin Harrison Jr. had his breakout game in week 2. He caught 4 passes for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. Trey McBride caught 6 balls for 67 yards and scored on a fumble for a touchdown as well. The dynamic wide receiver and tight end duo elevates Kyler Murray for fantasy football, who already has upside due to the rushing abilities, which has been evident the first 2 weeks with 57 and 59 yards. Murray threw 266 yards and 3 touchdowns in week 2 and scored the most fantasy points for the position with 28.54. So there's going to be a lot of offense in this Lions matchup for week 3, and they allow the 12th most passing yards and the 9th most fantasy points per game this season. I think Murray's set up to have another top 5 week in week 3. Ravens versus the Cowboys. Alvin Kamara just rushed for 115 yards and scored 4 total touchdowns on the Cowboys last week. Jerome Ford rushed for a touchdown against Dallas in week 1. Touchdown potential paired with the name Derrick Henry just sounds super juicy to me, right? Henry has scored a rushing touchdown in both games as a Raven so far this season. He's coming off of a much better week in terms of usage, 19 touches and rushing yards, 84 yards. The Cowboys allow the most fantasy points per game to running backs so far this season, obviously due to the big Kamara week. But the Ravens will look to gain their first win on of the season. So establishing the run and controlling the game on the ground could be in the cards if their defense can keep up with the Dallas Cowboys. A deep sleeper to keep in mind, Jalen Tolbert, who's coming off of a week where he played 86% of the snaps and caught 6 of his 9 targets for 82 yards. Dallas played from behind in a huge loss to the Saints last week, and Tolbert led the team in targets. CeeDee Lamb is dealing with an ankle injury. He's dealt with one this week that hasn't been serious. Jake Ferguson, I think, is going to be back. We're not sure at what percent. So Tolbert could remain a thing in week 3. The Ravens have allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the most passing yards this season. So if Lamb is, himself at a full go, he could be a monster this week. But I think in deeper leagues, take a look at Jalen Tolbert. Sorry, I'm talking too fast, man. 49ers versus the Rams. Jordan Mason is winning matchups in place of an injured Christian McCaffrey, so he is simply a must-start option weekly for fantasy football. Don't ask, should I start Jordan Mason? He's in. 28 rushing attempts for 147 yards and a touchdown in week 1 for 22.2 fantasy points, and then 20 rushing attempts for 100 yards and a touchdown in week 2 for 17.4 fantasy points. Just shows consistency in 2 things: volume and production. And what does that lead to? Good fantasy scoring. A workhorse role with the 49ers offense translates well for fantasy football and should definitely translate well against the Rams, who have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 3rd most rushing yards so far this season. In a perfectly healthy world, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and Tyler Higbee would likely be the top 3 targets for the Rams, and they're all off the field this week. That simply means somebody is going to have to step up through the air. And with a handful of names floating around there, the person I'm going to stick with is Demarcus Robinson. Last season, from weeks 13 through 17, Robinson finishes the wide receiver 21, the wide receiver 22, the wide receiver 26, the wide receiver 15, and the wide receiver 29 during that stretch of games as a true fantasy football flex option. Robinson has also played 92% of the snaps in both weeks with 11 total targets, but he has produced 42 and 50 yards so far this season in those 2 games. So if I'm going to throw a dart, it's going to be at the guy that is showing some receiving upside and the guy that went off for a stretch of games last season. All right, the last game we'll talk about today on this slate, the Sunday night football game, the Chiefs versus the Falcons. Rashee Rice should be highlighted simply because he looks great and continues to translate to fantasy football. He's earned 15 targets and caught 12 of them with receiving yard totals of 103 and 75 yards so far. Rice is also coming off of a week where he scored a receiving touchdown and has finished with 17.3 and 18.5 fantasy points in these 2 games. So the impressive rookie season continues into the sophomore year. Too many of us were, so worried about this possible suspension and the new target competitions coming in where, this guy just said, hey, I'm that guy, and he has been that guy. Rice currently has 7 more targets, 7 more reception, and 114 more receiving yards than any other player on the Chiefs right now. The Chiefs currently allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the 2nd most passing yards so far this season, making Kirk Cousins a good quarterback streamer this week. Cousins is coming off of a week where he scored 17.54 fantasy points. He threw 20 for 29 for 241 yards and 2 touchdowns. The surrounding weapons of Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Darnell Mooney are a boost to Cousins' ceiling, and there's going to be plenty of passing going on in this game. Keep in mind, there's 2 games on Monday, Jaguars versus the Bills, the Commanders versus the Bengals. Just real quick, I think ETN, the matchup for him on Monday is going to be a good one there. He's rushed for a touchdown in both weeks so far. He has yet to have the volume and the touches and the yardage or the pass catching role that we expect out of him, but we've seen that in the past, the last 2 seasons. So I think against the Bills, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs. It's set up nicely for ETN to have a good week. And you look at the Bills, the Jaguars allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. Khalil Shakir currently leads the Bills in targets with 8, receptions with 8, receiving yards with 96, and is one of 3 players that catch a touchdown. So if you're looking for a flex play, I don't know if he's got the upside that a lot of other guys do, but he's been the most consistent wide receiver so far for them. I think Austin Eckler and, in that Commanders versus Bengals game could be sneaky. He's had pretty good receiving so far this season. He actually leads the Commanders in receiving yards so far with 99 yards through 2 games. So he's not lighting it up for fantasy football, but he's been a guy that scores double-digit fantasy points 2 weeks in a row with some receiving upside. And I get, against the Bengals might be a lot more dump-offs and ways to use him. The Commanders allow the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. If this isn't a get-right game for Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, I don't know what is. It's got to be this week. Thank you guys for tuning in, though. Make sure you are following and subscribe to the Fantrax socials. I got 2 questions here I'm going to run through, and then I got to get going, but really appreciate you guys tuning in. Would you trade Puka, Marvin, Ford for Evansdale and Chuba? I have Brooks, K9, Zamir, and Amari, Deontay, Keon. Would you trade Puka, Marvin, Ford for Evansdale and Chuba? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because if you make the fantasy playoffs and you could have had Puka Nacua and Marvin Harrison Jr. on your team, I think you just lost so much value right there. Ford's about even with Chuba Hubbard, I think. Evans is behind both Puka and Marv for me. Dell is behind Puka and Marv for me. That would be a very bad decision. Would you flex Aaron Jones, Steele, or Neighbors this week? Go with the guy that has scored over 28 fantasy points, look like an absolute baller, look like a future dynasty top 5 wide receiver in Neighbors. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Good luck this week. You can follow me on X at P2W Fantasy. Here to help you guys win those championships.